In the dazzling world of ancient Rome, hidden behind the grand marble columns and gilded palaces, lay a grim reality that history often neglects to mention. While we praise Rome's military victories, architectural achievements, and legal reforms, we seldom acknowledge those who bore the heaviest burden to sustain this grandeur: young men compelled into servitude as male concubines for the wealthy and powerful. These were not merely servants or slaves carrying out domestic tasks. They were individuals ensnared in a system crafted to exploit their youth, beauty, and vulnerability for the pleasure of Rome's elite. Their narratives unveil a facet of the Roman Empire that disrupts our idealized perceptions, exposing the harsh truth of what it meant to be powerless in a world governed by force. Before we delve into these overlooked stories of endurance and hardship, if you appreciate uncovering hidden historical truths, please hit the like button and subscribe for more content like this. Also, leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from. It's remarkable that we're journeying through these ancient tales together, across continents and centuries, united by our curiosity about the past. The Roman approach to intimate companionship was vastly unlike our modern views. Where today we might clearly distinguish consent from coercion, Romans understood a complex social hierarchy where power dictated all. At the bottom of this hierarchy were young men, often captured from conquered lands or born into slavery, thrust into roles they never chose. Many of these youths, barely in their teens, were chosen not for their talents or intellect, but for their looks and perceived ability to entertain their masters. Their lives were filled with uncertainty, never knowing when they'd be called upon, what would be demanded, or how refusal or compliance might influence their fate. The selection process was profoundly dehumanizing. Wealthy Romans frequented slave markets much like modern shoppers attend livestock auctions, assessing potential acquisitions based on physical traits, age, and origin. Young men from Greece were especially prized for their perceived sophistication and education, while those from Germanic tribes were favored for their fair skin and strong build. These buyers showed no regard for the terror these youths endured, standing exposed and vulnerable as strangers evaluated their worth. Once bought, these concubines entered households where their lives ceased to belong to them. They were expected to be available at all hours, anticipating their master's desires before being asked, and to maintain an appearance of willing participation regardless of their true feelings. The psychological burden of such a life is immense. Imagine being forced to smile and appear thankful while subjected to treatment that shattered every shred of your dignity and autonomy. The daily life of a male concubine varied greatly depending on the preferences and status of their master. Some were housed in lavish quarters, adorned in fine clothing, and granted access to education and cultural pursuits. However, these privileges always came with a heavy price. Others endured conditions barely better than those of ordinary slaves, summoned only when their master desired companionship, and then sent back to cramped quarters devoid of privacy, personal belongings, or hope of escape. What made their plight especially tragic was the total absence of legal protections or avenues for recourse. Although Roman law afforded certain rights to citizens, and even some protections to slaves, male concubines existed in a legal gray zone where their master's desires trumped any concern for their welfare. They could not seek assistance from authorities, form meaningful relationships, or voice their suffering without risking severe punishment. The psychological manipulation inflicted upon these young men was often more damaging than the physical hardships of their servitude. Masters employed strategies to dismantle resistance and foster dependence. Some concubines were occasionally granted special favors or temporary kindnesses, only to have these withdrawn as punishment for perceived offenses. This unpredictable treatment fostered a constant state of anxiety and uncertainty, leaving the concubines unsure whether they were in favor or facing retribution. Many masters deliberately isolated their concubines from other members of the household, preventing them from forming friendships or alliances that might provide emotional support. This isolation was particularly cruel for young men forcibly separated from their families and communities. severing ties to their identities and cultures. The competitive environment in some households added further psychological torment. Masters who kept multiple concubines often set them against one another in a relentless struggle for attention and privileges. This rivalry thwarted solidarity among the victims and fostered an atmosphere filled with tension and betrayal. Instead of finding comfort in shared experiences, young men competed for their master's favor, knowing that losing it could lead to even harsher treatment. The education offered to some concubines served as yet another means of control. While learning to read, write, and engage in philosophical discourse might appear as opportunities, these skills were primarily taught to make the concubines more appealing companions. They were expected to discuss literature and politics only in ways that pleased their masters. Their education was another tool to mold them into ideal objects of entertainment. Maintaining their physical appearance was governed by strict regimens that concubines had no choice but to follow. They were required to exercise regularly, adhere to strict diets, and undergo grooming routines designed to preserve a youthful and attractive appearance. Some even underwent cosmetic treatments or surgeries tailored to their master's preferences. These procedures were carried out without the benefit of modern medical knowledge or pain relief, making them both perilous and agonizing. The clothing and jewelry worn by concubines served both as decoration and symbols of ownership. Masters often took pride in how exquisitely they could dress their companions, treating them like living dolls rather than human beings. The cruel irony was that, though draped in silk and gold, these concubines remained completely powerless beneath their elegant adornments. Travel was another aspect of their lives that might appear as a privilege but was actually another form of control. Some concubines accompanied their masters on journeys to different cities or provinces, but this travel was never voluntary. They were treated as portable property, expected to provide the same services regardless of location, while adapting silently to new environments and social settings. The social hierarchy within Roman households posed additional challenges for male concubines. While they might enjoy luxurious surroundings, they held no true status. Other slaves often looked down upon them, viewing their role as shameful, and free household members considered them mere distractions rather than individuals worthy of respect or consideration. The impact on the families left behind was profound. When young men were taken as concubines, their families frequently never learned what became of them. Parents could spend years wondering if their sons were alive or dead, unaware that they were trapped in circumstances from which escape was nearly impossible. This separation was especially cruel in cultures where family bonds were sacred and community support vital for survival. Some concubines were acquired through debt slavery, where families facing financial ruin were forced to give up sons to settle debts. These families faced the heartbreaking choice of watching all their children suffer or sacrificing one son to save the others. The psychological toll on both families and young men was immense, as all involved understood the gravity of the sacrifice. The few historical accounts of concubines attempting escape paint a picture of desperate young men taking enormous risks for even the smallest chance of freedom. Punishments for failed attempts were harsh and public, designed to deter others. These penalties often included not only physical pain, but also public humiliation, as masters sought to demonstrate their absolute control over their property. Some concubines sought to end their suffering through suicide, but even this final escape was frequently denied. Masters, who had invested heavily in purchasing and maintaining their concubines, implemented strict measures to prevent such losses, including constant supervision and removing any objects that could be used for self-harm. The religious landscape of Roman society offered no solace to these young men. Though Romans worshipped gods associated with protection and justice, these divine safeguards seemingly did not extend to male concubines. Some found comfort in foreign religions or mystery cults, but even these spiritual practices had to be kept secret, as masters controlled every aspect of their concubines' lives, including their religious beliefs. The economic worth assigned to concubines fueled a market that perpetuated the ongoing capture and sale of young men. Wealthy Romans vied to acquire the most beautiful or talented companions, driving prices upward and incentivizing traders to keep supplying this demand. The commodification of these young lives reached its peak in such transactions, where their value was reduced to mere monetary figures. Specialized training schools were established to prepare young men for their roles as concubines, much like gladiator schools trained fighters for the arena. These institutions were both harsh and lucrative, methodically breaking down their students' personalities and resistance while instructing them in the skills their future masters required. The curriculum included not only physical conditioning but also psychological training aimed at producing compliant and appealing companions. The age at which boys entered this life varied, though many were still children when their fates were sealed. The impact of growing up under such conditions is profound. These youths never had the chance to build normal relationships, cultivate personal interests, or grasp what healthy human connections truly entail. Differences in treatment of concubines across the Roman Empire reflected its cultural diversity, yet none of these variations offered genuine protection or dignity. Some regions maintained slightly better standards through local customs, while others were even more severe. Regardless of geography, the fundamental lack of freedom and autonomy was constant. The aging or retirement of concubines revealed another harsh reality. Unlike other slaves who might eventually purchase or earn their freedom, concubines who lost their physical allure were often discarded without means or skills for independent living. Some were simply abandoned by their masters, while others were sold to households of lower status where conditions worsened. Instances of concubines gaining freedom and achieving success later in life are rare and remarkable. These individuals frequently had to completely reinvent themselves, concealing their past and overcoming the deep psychological scars left by their earlier ordeals. While inspiring, these stories underscore how exceptional it was for anyone to escape this brutal system unscathed. Medical care for concubines was driven by property value, not compassion. Masters sought to preserve their investments by maintaining their health and attractiveness, providing treatment only when necessary. However, this care focused solely on appearance and function, disregarding psychological health or long-term effects. The widespread acceptance of this system among Roman elites reveals much about the moral framework of ancient Rome. Though Romans boasted of honor, duty, and virtue, these principles clearly applied only to free citizens of suitable social standing. The suffering of concubines was dismissed in moral considerations, highlighting the extent of their dehumanization in Roman society. Some concubines developed what we might now identify as survival tactics, learning to read their master's moods, anticipate desires, and skillfully navigate the intricate social dynamics within their households. While these abilities help them avoid the harshest punishments, they also force them to become skilled performers, constantly displaying contentment and gratitude while hiding their true emotions. The cyclical rhythms of Roman social life also shaped the experiences of concubines. During major festivals and celebrations, they were often expected to participate in elaborate entertainments, whereas quieter times brought brief reprieves from constant scrutiny. Yet even in these quieter moments, anxiety lingered as they wondered when they might be summoned again. Communication between concubines or other slaves was typically restricted, but when possible, these young men created covert networks of support and information exchange. They developed subtle gestures and coded signals to warn each other about their master's moods, or to offer comfort during especially difficult periods. These secret connections provided essential emotional sustenance in an otherwise isolating existence. The effects of this system extended beyond its direct victims, influencing Roman society at large. The widespread acceptance of treating humans as objects for pleasure contributed to a broader culture of exploitation and dehumanization. This cultural normalization made it easier for Romans to justify other brutal practices, from gladiatorial combats to the harsh suppression of slave uprisings. Archaeological findings offer rare glimpses into the lives of these overlooked individuals. Objects discovered in affluent Roman homes include tools likely used to control or monitor concubines, alongside personal items that hint at their daily realities. However, most physical evidence has been lost over time, just as their voices were silenced in life. Literary mentions of male concubines in Roman texts tend to be brief and euphemistic, reflecting authors' reluctance to detail the more disturbing aspects. Yet between the lines, the harsh reality of lives marked by powerlessness and exploitation is evident. Transitions, when concubines were transferred between masters, were particularly traumatic. They faced the uncertainty of unfamiliar households, new expectations, and unpredictable degrees of cruelty or kindness. Each move required them to relearn survival strategies while maintaining the psychological defenses that had sustained them before. Some masters treated concubines as fleeting entertainments, quickly losing interest and either selling them or relegating them to menial household roles. Others formed long-term attachments that, although still exploitative, offered some degree of stability and predictability. Neither scenario provided true security, as concubines' fates remained entirely at the mercy of their masters. The seasonal migration of wealthy Romans between city homes and country estates meant that many concubines spent their lives shifting between environments and social contexts. This constant change demanded great psychological adaptability, but prevented them from forming roots or lasting bonds with places or people. The education of concubines in music, poetry, and conversation presented a cruel paradox. They were taught to appreciate beauty and culture, yet denied any chance to create or contribute to these arts themselves. Instead, they became living vessels of artistic knowledge and skill, always serving others' enjoyment rather than expressing their own. Physical training regimens imposed on concubines aimed to preserve their allure for their masters, but these routines were often harsh and exhausting. Young men had no choice but to endure whatever exercise, diet restrictions, or bodily modifications their masters demanded, no matter the toll on their physical or mental health. Roman festivals and seasonal celebrations imposed additional demands on concubines, who were expected to participate in elaborate entertainments or private ceremonies. While these occasions might appear festive to outsiders, for the concubines, they were further opportunities for humiliation and exploitation. Building personal relationships with other household members was complicated by the ambiguous status of concubines. Though they might enjoy relative luxury, it was understood by all that their position depended entirely on their master's favor, making true friendships or romantic connections nearly impossible. The regional trade networks supplying concubines extended throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. This system fueled warfare, kidnapping, and debt slavery, as traders worked to satisfy the demand of wealthy Roman households. The human cost of maintaining this supply was enormous, affecting not only the concubines themselves but also entire communities and cultures. Training and conditioning concubines involved more than teaching specific skills. It included psychological manipulation designed to break down resistance and foster dependence. Masters and their agents became adept at exploiting psychological vulnerabilities through techniques recognizable today as systematic abuse. The clothing and adornments worn by concubines served multiple roles beyond decoration. These items marked their social status, displayed their master's wealth and taste, and served as constant reminders of their lack of freedom. Even their physical appearance was controlled. Medical and grooming practices often involved painful, dangerous, or permanently disfiguring procedures carried out without the concubine's consent or comfort, treating their bodies as objects to be altered according to their master's wishes. Growing up or spending formative years under such conditions inflicted lasting psychological harm that touched every aspect of these young men's lives. They were denied the chance to develop normal understandings of consent, autonomy, or healthy relationships, making recovery extremely difficult even if they later gained freedom. Social isolation imposed on many concubines hindered the development of social skills and connections that might have aided survival or escape. This isolation was often intentional, as masters sought to prevent their property from forming alliances or receiving outside assistance. The economic calculations that determined concubines' destinies reduced human beings to mere monetary values, with prices fluctuating according to factors like age, appearance, skills, and origin. This commodification made it easier for masters to justify treating them as disposable objects rather than as individuals deserving of fundamental dignity and respect. The normalization of such exploitation and dehumanization had far-reaching effects on Roman society. A culture that accepted the systematic abuse of vulnerable young men was also prepared to tolerate other forms of cruelty and injustice, contributing to the widespread oppression that characterized much of Roman history. The limited evidence of resistance and rebellion among concubines reveals the desperate efforts some made to reclaim their humanity and dignity. Though often doomed and harshly punished, these acts of defiance show that the human spirit could not be entirely extinguished, even under extreme oppression. Rome's religious and philosophical frameworks offered no real protection or solace for these victims. While Romans debated complex issues of ethics and virtue, they seemingly saw no contradiction between these ideals and the systematic exploitation of powerless young men. The cyclical nature of Roman social life created predictable patterns of exploitation, with certain seasons bringing intensified demands on concubines' time and energy. Even during quieter periods, they lived with the anxiety of anticipating busier, more demanding times ahead. The repercussions of this system extended beyond the individuals to impact the families and communities from which concubines were taken. The removal of young men disrupted not just the victims but entire social networks, adding to the widespread suffering caused by Roman expansion and exploitation. Training and conditioning concubines involved systematic methods aimed at breaking down their psychological defenses and ensuring compliance. Refined over generations, this system was both highly efficient and profoundly damaging to its victims. Legally, concubines were invisible, treated as property without rights. This lack of legal recognition rendered their suffering invisible as well, allowing masters to act with impunity while society averted its gaze. Economic incentives perpetuated this cycle of exploitation, as profits from human trade encouraged the ongoing capture and abuse of young men. Breaking this vicious cycle would have required fundamental shifts in Roman societal values, changes that never materialized. The physical and psychological conditioning imposed on concubines aimed to enforce complete submission, but exacted an immense human cost. These young men were systematically stripped of their autonomy, dignity, and identity, often never regaining these essential aspects, even if they eventually gained freedom. As we reflect on these forgotten tales of suffering and endurance, we must remember that behind every historical statistic was a real person with hopes, fears, and dreams that were never allowed to thrive. The concubines of ancient Rome were not mere footnotes in history. They were individuals whose lives reveal profound truths about power, exploitation, and human resilience. Their stories compel us to look beyond the marble facades and golden treasures of Rome to understand the human cost underpinning this civilization's grandeur. They remind us that progress often came at the expense of society's most vulnerable, with the price of luxury and power frequently paid by those without choice. The systematic nature of this exploitation illustrates how easily societies can normalize and institutionalize cruelty when it benefits the powerful. The Romans' capacity to uphold complex philosophical and legal systems while managing a vast network of human trafficking exposes the selective morality that defends existing power structures. These young men's experiences also highlight the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. Despite enduring conditions designed to break them entirely, many found ways to preserve a sense of self and dignity. Their small acts of resistance, moments of connection, and will to survive stand as triumphs of humanity against systematic dehumanization. Understanding their histories helps us recognize similar patterns of abuse and exploitation today. Though the forms may have evolved, the core dynamics of power, vulnerability, and oppression remain relevant. Their experiences warn us about the consequences when societies permit the powerful to treat others as objects for pleasure and profit. The long silence surrounding these stories reflects our ongoing discomfort with confronting the full scope of historical injustice. By restoring these forgotten voices to history, we honor their memory and reaffirm our responsibility to prevent such abuses from recurring. The concubines of ancient Rome lived and died in conditions no human should ever face. Their stories deserve remembrance not as titillating curiosities but as testimonies to suffering and resilience. In remembering them, we acknowledge their humanity and commit to building a world where such exploitation is impossible. Their legacy challenges us to scrutinize how we treat society's most vulnerable today, and to consider what future historians might reveal about the injustices we currently ignore or accept. The questions their stories raise about power, consent, and human dignity are as urgent now as they were 2 millennia ago. Ultimately, the harrowing life of a male concubine in the Roman Empire starkly reminds us that civilization's greatest achievements often rest on foundations of terrible cruelty. By acknowledging this truth, we honor those who suffered and pledge to ensure that such systematic dehumanization never again becomes the hidden cost of progress and prosperity.